The notification lit up my phone, a single venomous subject line from my private investigator. Thorne. I didn't need to see the photos. I knew exactly what they would show. My wife, Isabella, leaving the penthouse of Marcus Thorne, my business rival, the man I was secretly planning to ruin. He thought this was his checkmate, a personal, devastating blow to shatter my focus before the hostile takeover. He saw Isabella as a weapon to break me. What Thorne, in his arrogant blindness, failed to understand was that some weapons have a secondary function. He thought he was lighting a fuse to destroy my world. He had no idea he was lighting the fuse on a bomb I had placed directly underneath his own. Marcus Thorne. He's the textbook predator of Wall Street's new guard, a man who mistakes aggression for strategy. He built his empire on scorched earth tactics and cheap headlines, thinking that made him a king. He saw our rivalry as a primitive battle for territory, a zero-sum game where only one could survive. He was a pit bull, all teeth and brute force, charging at a shadow he couldn't possibly comprehend. And Isabella, my brilliant, beautiful wife. Thorne saw her as the ultimate prize, a trophy to be stolen from my mantelpiece. He believed her sighs in his bed were confessions of a broken marriage, not rehearsals for a performance. He saw a damsel in distress. He should have seen a Trojan horse. For 15 years she'd been my partner in every sense, a mind as sharp and ruthless as my own. He thought he was poaching a lamb from a rival's flock. He had no idea she was leading the wolf right to his door. And me? I'm Damian Croft. For 2 decades at Sterling Vance Holdings, I haven't just bought companies. I have dismantled dynasties. Thorne thought this was a fight about a woman. This was never about my wife. It was about his extinction. The memory attached to those photos wasn't jealousy. It was fuel. It took me back 5 years, to the sterile white boardroom of a company called Vance, Isabella's father's legacy. He'd built it from nothing, a testament to old-world engineering and integrity. I was trying to help him structure a sale, a dignified exit to preserve his life's work. Then Thorne crashed the deal. He didn't come to negotiate, he came to conquer. He used a shell corporation and a mountain of debt to orchestrate a brutal, hostile takeover. But he didn't stop there. Winning wasn't enough for Marcus. He needed to humiliate. At the press conference announcing the acquisition, he called my father-in-law's company a charming antique. He was gutting for a few useful parts. He liquidated everything, fired 2,000 employees, and sold the headquarters to be demolished for luxury condos. 2 weeks later, Isabella's father had a massive stroke. He's been in a silent, vegetative world ever since. Thorne sent a ridiculously opulent floral arrangement to the hospital. The card read, "For new beginnings." That night, our penthouse was a tomb. I was staring at a wall of financial charts, plotting a conventional market war, a slow, bleeding death for his portfolio. Isabella came and stood beside me, her reflection a pale mask in the dark glass. She'd been silent for days. "He'll see that coming," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You'll hurt his company, he'll hurt yours. It's just a game to him, it's not enough." "What is?" I asked, turning to face her. Her eyes were flint. "He doesn't respect money, Damian, he respects power. And he sees women as acquisitions, the ultimate symbol of another man's defeat." The air grew cold as I understood. The sheer, terrifying brilliance of it. The cost. "Isabella, no. He's already been making overtures," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Subtle at first, charitable galas, lingering handshakes. He thinks he's laying a trap for you by targeting me." She looked me dead in the eye, a soldier accepting her mission. Let him think he's stealing your most prized possession. Let him believe he's breaking you." She stepped closer, her hand finding mine. It was cold as marble. "He'll bring me into his home, into his company, into his confidence. He'll show me every weakness, every secret, because he'll be too arrogant to see anything but a conquest." Her voice dropped to a whisper, a vow of pure steel. "He thinks he's lighting a fire to burn down your life. Well, let him. And when he's standing in the middle of it, admiring his work, I will be the one who douses him in gasoline." So when I looked at the PI's photo on my phone, I didn't see a cheating wife, I saw a progress report. Phase 1 of his obliteration was complete. The horse was inside the gates of Troy. The theater of our collapse had to be public. We chose the annual Metropolitan Museum Gala, a stage flooded with the city's most powerful gossips, to perform our first act. We argued near the Temple of Dendur, a meticulously choreographed storm of hushed, cutting remarks. I played the neglectful, work-obsessed husband to perfection. She was the brilliant, lonely wife, finally shattering under the strain. Every eye that flickered towards us, every sympathetic glance she received was a victory. And right on cue, Marcus Thorne materialized at her side, a predator in a bespoke suit, offering a comforting arm and a condescending, triumphant glance in my direction. I let him see the flicker of defeat in my eyes as he led her away into the crowd. He thought he was witnessing a marriage crumble in real time. We were laying a foundation. Isabella played her role with a terrifying, innate precision. She never asked him for secrets. That would be too obvious. She simply created a vacuum of validation that he was desperate to fill. Over late-night dinners in his sterile, glass-walled penthouse, she would lament my conservative approach at Sterling Vance, my obsession with risk analysis. "Damian would never have the nerve for a play like that," she'd sigh, swirling a glass of wine he'd boasted cost more than a car. And Thorne, preening, desperate to prove himself the bigger man, the more audacious player, would puff out his chest and boast. He'd sketch out his strategies on cocktail napkins, revealing leverage points and the names of shell corporations, not to a spy, but to a beautiful woman he believed was finally seeing the light. He was so busy gloating over the wife he'd stolen, he never noticed he was handing her the keys to his entire kingdom. Our communication was a ghost in the machine of our digital world, strictly analog. Every Tuesday, I'd visit the rare books room at the New York Public Library. Isabella would have been there an hour earlier. A single, folded sheet of paper, no thicker than a whisper, would be tucked into page 347 of a first-edition Moby Dick, Thorne's favorite novel, a book he pontificated on endlessly. The irony was a small, bitter pleasure. But in the hours after reading her reports, the silence of our penthouse was a physical weight. I'd stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city that was our battlefield, and feel the phantom limb of her presence. This was the true cost of our war, not the public humiliation I endured, but the private, soul-crushing desolation. We were two soldiers in separate foxholes, fighting the same enemy under a sky of absolute silence. Then, 3 months in, the note was different. Colder. Sharper. Just 2 words and a string of digits. The Albatross account. The numbers were a routing code for an unregistered, unaudited holding entity in the Cayman Islands. This was it, the gasoline she promised to find. It was the answer to the question that had plagued analysts for years. How did Thorne's portfolio always outperform the market, even when his public acquisitions were mediocre? The Albatross account was where he hid the toxic assets from his most predatory takeovers, a financial black hole he used to illegally inflate the value of his primary company, Thorne Industries. He'd shown it to Isabella on his private laptop one night, a quick, arrogant flash of the screen to illustrate his real net worth, the kind the SEC could never touch. He thought he was showing her the crown jewels. Instead, he'd just handed my wife the detonator for the bomb under his throne. The data she'd transcribed wasn't just a smoking gun. It was the blueprint for a tactical nuclear strike on his entire life's work. The hunt was over. It was time to gut the whale. I left the library without a flicker of emotion, the folded paper a thin, cold rectangle in my pocket. There was no elation, no triumphant surge of adrenaline. There was only a profound, crystalline stillness, the calm a surgeon feels making the first incision. The hunt wasn't over. It had just entered its final, bloody stage. Back in the sterile silence of my office at Sterling Vance, I sat at my desk and stared out at the Manhattan skyline. Thorne's tower glinted in the afternoon sun, an arrogant steel and glass monument to his own ego. He was probably in his penthouse right now, celebrating his conquest, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire empire was balanced on a single invisible wire that I was now holding. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't need to run the numbers. I knew exactly what they would show. Instead, I picked up my private line and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang once. "Julian," I said, my voice level. "Julian Hayes, my chief counsel. A man who'd been with me for 20 years. A man who understood that the most devastating moves are made in silence." Damian. His voice was a low rumble, ever cautious. He knew this call was coming. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The albatross is real. We have the routing codes." There was a pause on the line, not of surprise, but of profound, grim understanding. A deep, slow breath. "Dear God," he finally whispered. "The ghost ledger, the SEC filings, the shell core, it will all unravel." "I want our teams ready to move in 48 hours, I instructed, my eyes fixed on Thorne's building. "I want to short every stock he's ever touched. I want to freeze every asset. When we are done, Julian, I want Marcus Thorne to own nothing but the suit on his back, and I want that suit to be on fire." Another pause, this one heavier. "And Isabella?" Julian asked, his voice laced with the concern he rarely showed. The question hung in the air, a shard of ice in my gut. I thought of her, alone in the enemy camp, her mission almost complete. "Isabella," I said, my voice hardening into a promise, "is coming home." I hung up. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel the true weight of it all. The public humiliation, the whispers at every board meeting, the image of her with him, a constant grinding stone against my soul. This wasn't just business, it was an exorcism. Thorne thought he had stolen my queen to topple my kingdom. He never realized he had handed her the very sword she would use to sever his head from his body. The whale was harpooned. Now it was time to bleed him dry. 48 hours, a lifetime, and no time at all. My war room wasn't in some subterranean bunker. It was the east wing of my penthouse, stripped of art and furniture, replaced with a constellation of glowing screens. Julian and his team, a dozen of the sharpest legal and financial minds in the country, moved with the hushed, grim efficiency of an assassination squad. They didn't speak of shorts or derivatives. They spoke of severing supply lines and collapsing flanks. They were mapping the arteries of Thorne's empire, preparing to bleed every single one of them dry at my command. But before the financial blitzkrieg could begin, I had to send the signal, the one we had established all those months ago, a beacon only Isabella would recognize. The signal was a painting, The Shipwreck by Claude Joseph Vernet. A dramatic, chaotic scene of a ship being torn apart by a merciless sea, while a few survivors cling to the rocks. To the world it was just another trophy for a billionaire's wall. To Isabella and me it represented her father's company. Thorne was the storm. We were the survivors on the rocks, waiting for the tide to turn. The painting was scheduled for auction at Sotheby's the next evening. My winning bid would be her green light. I watched the auction via a private live feed, a glass of untouched scotch on the desk beside me. The bidding was brisk, but I was a ghost in the machine, my bids placed electronically through a proxy. When the hammer finally fell, the price was obscene, a new record for the artist. The commentators would call it an act of ego, a power play from a wounded titan. Thorne would see it that way too, a desperate, pathetic gesture. He wouldn't see the message encoded within it. The storm is coming. Abandon ship. Across the city, in his glass box in the sky, Isabella saw it. I knew she would be. Thorne would have the auction on his own wall-sized screen, a cigar in one hand, a drink in the other, gloating. I could picture the moment perfectly, the final bid flashing on the screen, my anonymous proxy confirmed as the winner. Thorne would laugh, a deep, arrogant rumble. He'd turn to Isabella, probably say something dismissive like, "Looks like your husband is redecorating his cage." And in that moment, she would begin the final act. Her next note, left in our usual dead drop, confirmed it. It was just 4 words. "He's taking the bait." The bait was a masterpiece of misdirection, a story she'd been carefully weaving for weeks. She told Thorne I was about to make a reckless, desperate move to save my reputation, a massive, over-leveraged acquisition of a German tech firm. She painted me as a cornered animal, lashing out, pushing all my chips into one foolish, last-ditch play. She even produced fabricated emails, documents I had created and passed to her, outlining the deal. It was everything Thorne ever wanted to believe about me, that I was predictable, emotional, and ultimately a lesser predator. His ego, stoked by her performance, couldn't resist. To be the one to personally gut my final, desperate gambit? It was irresistible. To prove to Isabella, once and for all, that he was the superior man, he decided to strike first. He would short my company, Sterling Vance, betting everything on my failure, and simultaneously attempt his own takeover of the same German firm, boxing me out and humiliating me on a global stage. To do it, he would have to pull massive funds from his other ventures. He would have to liquidate assets. And, most importantly, he would have to draw from the untouchable illegal slush fund, the Albatross account. He was exposing his king, moving it to the center of the board for a killing blow, never realizing he was walking it directly into my line of fire. The final 24 hours were a study in silence. My team was in position. Algorithms were coded, sell orders were queued, and press releases, detailing every shred of evidence from the Albatross account, were drafted and ready to be sent to every major financial news outlet and federal regulator in the world. All of it was tied to a single digital command on my terminal, a kill switch for Marcus Thorne's entire existence. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, the city lights a sprawling, indifferent galaxy below. I hadn't slept. The cost of this victory was etched onto my soul. I thought of Isabella, a lone operative in the heart of the enemy stronghold, playing the role of the devoted consort while knowing the walls were about to be leveled. Her courage was a fire that burned away my own exhaustion. My private phone buzzed on the desk, a single, encrypted text from a burner number. It wasn't a message from Isabella, but from her prearranged exit strategy, a security professional I had on standby posing as a driver. The text was simple. The final confirmation, asterisk package is on the move, ETA 15 minutes. She was out. She was clear of the blast radius. I walked back to my desk, the city's reflection following me in the polished black marble. On the main screen, a single, pulsating red button waited. Below it, a cascade of real-time data showed Thorne's capital consolidating, flowing from the Cayman Islands into the mainland exchanges, ready for his big move against me at the market's opening bell. He was concentrating his forces for an attack, completely unaware that he was gathering them together for a slaughter. He thought this was his moment of ultimate triumph, the culmination of his victory, with my wife at his side and my company in his crosshairs. He was probably pouring champagne, the arrogant smile spreading across his face. I placed my hand on the mouse. The calm I felt was absolute, a profound and terrifying peace. This wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even revenge. It was a correction, a balancing of the scales. For Isabella's father. For the 2,000 employees he'd discarded like trash. For the silent, agonizing months of our shared deception. My finger hovered over the button. The king was in his castle, admiring his stolen queen, oblivious to the armies that had already breached the walls and were standing behind him with daggers drawn. The sun was about to rise on a new day in New York City. For Marcus Thorne, it would be his last. I clicked the mouse. There was no sound in the room, but on the screens, a hurricane was unleashed. A silent digital apocalypse. 1,000 automated sell orders, triggered in a microsecond, slammed into the market. Algorithms, coded for this precise moment, began to short every stock tied to Thorne Industries. Red lines didn't just dip, they fell off cliffs. Across the globe, trading floors lit up with panic as billions in value evaporated into the ether. Simultaneously, the encrypted press releases, complete with the Albatross account's routing codes and transaction histories, hit the inboxes of the Wall Street Journal, the SEC, and the FBI. The kill switch had worked. It wasn't a hostile takeover, it was a digital assassination. I leaned back in my chair, my hand still on the mouse, and watched the symphony of destruction. Each flashing red alert was a note of retribution. Each plummeting stock chart was a verse in a hymn of ruin. The empire Marcus Thorne had built on swagger and scorched earth was being unwritten from history in a matter of seconds. The door to the penthouse hissed open and then clicked shut. I didn't turn. I knew her footsteps, the quiet, deliberate sound of them on the marble floor. She came to stand beside me, her reflection joining mine in the dark glass of the main screen, which now displayed a single screaming headline: Thorne Industries implodes amid massive fraud allegations. She said nothing. She simply placed her hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort or celebration. It was the touch of a fellow soldier, acknowledging the battle was over. The cost was written on her face, a profound weariness that mirrored my own. We had won, but the war had taken its pound of flesh from us both. My private line, the one only a handful of people had the number for, began to shriek. The caller ID displayed a single name: Thorne. Isabella's fingers tightened on my shoulder for a fraction of a second. I met her eyes in the reflection, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, and answered, putting the call on speaker. "What have you done?" The voice was a raw, strangled sound, stripped of its usual arrogance. It was the sound of a king watching his castle burn. "It's called a correction, Marcus," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "The market is simply correcting your existence." "My lawyers, the SEC, this is illegal." "You've ruined me," he roared, the panic breaking through his fury. I could hear things smashing in the background, glass shattering. "You ruined yourself the day you put 2,000 people out of work and sent flowers to a dying man's hospital bed," I said coldly. The Albatross account was a nice touch, though, very creative. The federal prosecutor seemed to think so too. There was a choked silence on the other end. The sound of a man's entire reality collapsing. He was processing it, trying to find a move on a board that no longer existed. Then his voice returned, a venomous whisper. "She told you, that bitch, after everything I gave her." I let the silence hang for a beat, letting him savor the poison of his own assumption. Then, I delivered the final, killing blow. "You have it backwards, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping low, each word a perfectly weighted stone. "You didn't give her anything. She took. You were so busy admiring the trophy on your arm, you never once thought to ask why she was there." "What? What are you talking about?" he stammered. "Isabella wasn't your prize for defeating me," I said, glancing at her reflection beside me. Her eyes were chips of ice. "She was my weapon to destroy you. Every secret you whispered, every account number you flaunted to prove what a big man you were. She delivered it all right to me. You didn't steal my wife, Marcus. I sent her." The only sound from the phone was a sharp, ragged intake of breath, a sound of pure, soul-shattering comprehension. He finally understood. He hadn't won a thing. He had been a willing participant in his own execution, led to the gallows by the very woman he thought was his ultimate conquest. I ended the call. Silence returned to the room, broken only by the faint hum of the servers. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the city, casting long shadows between the skyscrapers. Thorne's tower, his arrogant monument to himself, was just another building now, hollowed out from the inside. Isabella's hand slid from my shoulder to find my own. Her fingers were cold, but they laced through mine with unshakable strength. We stood there together, two survivors on the rocks, watching the storm we had created finally, mercifully, recede. The tide had turned. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever staged. The war was won, the enemy vanquished, but the adrenaline left a hollow, ringing void. I turned from the screens, from the digital ghost of Marcus Thorne, and finally looked at my wife. Not the character she had played, but the woman who had walked through fire. The weariness in her eyes was a debt I could never repay. She looked past me, toward the window where the morning light was washing the steel canyons of the city in pale gold. "Is it enough?" she whispered, the question not for me, but for the ghost in the room, the father she was fighting for. "No," I said, and she turned to me, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "It's not enough. But it's a start." I held out my hand. "Come on, there's someone we need to tell." The drive out of the city was silent. We left the battlefield of Wall Street behind, trading skyscrapers for the quiet, tree-lined roads of Westchester. The high-end care facility was serene, a place designed to disguise the grim reality within. Her father's room was bright, filled with morning sun, but he was a statue in the bed, his eyes open but seeing nothing. Isabella walked to his side and took his frail, unresponsive hand in hers. Her composure, the steel armor she had worn for months, finally cracked. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's done. Marcus Thorne, he's gone. Everything he took from you, it's gone." She squeezed his hand gently. "We didn't get it back, but we balanced the scales. You can rest." I stood in the doorway, a silent witness. This was the true endgame. Not the flashing red on a stock ticker, not the ruin of a rival, but this quiet, painful moment of tribute. Thorne thought our war was about money and power, the language of his world. He could never have understood. Our victory wasn't measured in his billions lost, but in this single, silent tear of a daughter keeping a promise to her father. It wasn't a victory that brought joy. It was a victory that brought peace. And for the first time in 5 years, it felt like we could finally begin to heal. So I have to ask you all, does the intent to betray matter more than the act itself, especially when the person has no idea what's really going on?